How medieval people fought without guns. Hi guys, welcome back to another deep dive into the fascinating world of history. Tonight, we're traveling back in time to explore one of the most captivating periods in human civilization, the medieval. For over 1,000 years, from roughly 500 to 1500 CE, people across Europe, Asia, and beyond engaged in warfare using nothing but muscle, metal, and no gunpowder, no firearms, no explosives, just raw human determination and the weapons they could forge with their own. We'll journey through the evolution of medieval combat, from the early days of simple spears and shields to the sophisticated castle sieges and knightly tournaments that defined. You'll discover how warriors trained from childhood to become lethal fighters, how massive fortifications were built and conquered, and how entire societies organized themselves around the art of medieval warfare. We'll explore the weapons that shaped history, the tactics that won kingdoms, and the people who lived and died by the sword long before anyone had ever heard the crack of a musket or the boom of a cannon. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. The story of medieval warfare begins not with grand battles or legendary heroes, but with necessity. In the centuries following the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe found itself fragmented into countless small kingdoms, duchies, and tribal territories. Without the organized legions that had once maintained the Pax Romana, communities had to fend for themselves against raiders, rival clans, and ambitious neighbors. This necessity gave birth to a warrior culture that would dominate the medieval landscape for centuries to come. In those early days of the medieval period, around the 6th and 7th centuries, warfare was relatively simple but brutally effective. The primary weapon of choice was the spear, a long wooden shaft topped with an iron or steel point. Spears were cheap to produce, easy to use, and devastatingly effective when wielded by trained fighters. A peasant could be taught to use a spear in a matter of weeks, making it the backbone of most early medieval armies. The spear's reach advantage meant that infantry formations could keep cavalry and other foot soldiers at a safe distance while delivering lethal threats. Alongside the ubiquitous spear, early medieval warriors carried shields made of wood, often reinforced with metal bands and covered in leather. These shields weren't just defensive tools, they were weapons in their own. A skilled warrior could use his shield to bash opponents, deflect incoming attacks, and create openings for counterattack. The round shield, typically 3 feet in diameter, became the standard for most European warriors during. The sword, though romanticized in later literature and films, was actually a secondary weapon for most medieval warriors. Swords were expensive to produce, requiring skilled blacksmiths and quality steel. They were primarily the weapons of the wealthy. Nobles, professional soldiers, and those who could afford such luxury items. Early medieval swords were typically single-edged and designed for slashing rather than thrusting. The famous Viking swords of this period were prized possessions. often given names and passed down through generations like family heirlooms. As the medieval period progressed, the nature of warfare began to evolve dramatically. The rise of heavy cavalry, particularly in Western Europe, changed everything. The development of the stirrup, which had been introduced from the East, revolutionized mounted combat. Suddenly, a rider could brace himself in the saddle and deliver devastating charges with a heavy lance without being thrown from his horse. This innovation led to the rise of the knightly class and the feudal system that supported it. Heavy cavalry required enormous resources to maintain. A knight needed not just a war horse, but often several horses for different purposes. A destrier for battle, a courser for traveling, and a palfrey for everyday riding. The armor and weapons required were equally expensive. A full suit of mail armor could cost as much as a small farm, and the great lances used by heavy cavalry were specialized weapons that required skilled craftsmanship. The training required to become an effective heavy cavalryman was extensive and began in Noble boys were typically sent away from home around age 7 to serve as pages in other noble households. There, they learned basic horsemanship, weapon handling, and the complex social codes that governed knightly behavior. At 14, they became squires, serving established knights and learning the finer points of combat and If they proved worthy, they might be knighted themselves around age 21, though this wasn't. The rise of heavy cavalry necessitated changes in infantry tactics as well. Foot soldiers had to develop new ways to counter mounted charge. The pike, a spear that could reach lengths of up to 20 feet, became increasingly pike formations, when properly disciplined, could present an impenetrable wall of steel points that no horse would willingly charge. The Swiss pikemen became legendary for their ability to break cavalry charges and maintain formation under the most intense pressure. Archers played an increasingly important role as medieval warfare evolved. The longbow, particularly as developed in Wales and later adopted by the English, became one. An English longbowman could loose 12 arrows per minute and the bodkin point arrows used against armored opponents could penetrate most. The training required to become an effective longbowman was as intensive as bowmen typically began training in childhood, developing the incredible strength and muscle memory required. The skeletons of medieval longbowmen showed distinctive bone deformations caused by the repetitive stress of drawing these powerful weapons. Enlarged left arms and overdeveloped back and shoulder muscles that marked them as professional archers, even Crossbows represented a different approach to ranged war. While they couldn't match the rate of fire of longbows, crossbows required much less training to use effectively. A crossbowman could be trained in a matter of months rather than years, making them attractive to commanders who needed to rapidly expand. The mechanical advantage provided by the crossbow's lever and pulley systems also allowed for much more powerful shots than most archers could achieve with. The crossbow became so effective that it was actually banned by the Catholic Church in 11. The Second Lateran Council declared the crossbow hateful to God and unfit for Christians. By the 13th century, crossbowmen were common in most European armies, and the Genoese crossbowmen became. As weapons became more sophisticated, so too did armor. The early medieval period was dominated by mail armor. thousands of interlocked metal rings that provided flexible protection. A full suit of mail, called a hauberk, could weigh 40 to 50 pounds, and mail was effective against swords and axes, but vulnerable to powerful thrusting attacks. The response to these vulnerabilities was the development. Beginning in the late 13th century, armorers began adding solid metal plates over vital areas like the chest. These plates provided superior protection against both arrows. By the 14th century, full plate armor had been developed, creating the classic image of the medieval knight that persists in popular culture today. Contrary to popular belief, properly fitted plate armor was a complete suit of plate armor typically weighed between 50 and 60 pounds. The weight was distributed across the entire body, and skilled knights could run, jump, and eat. The armor was articulated at all the joints, allowing the development of plate armor sparked an swords evolved to meet the challenge of the long sword, with its extended grip and versatile blade, became the weapon of choice for many knights. These swords could be used with one or two hands, and were designed for both cutting and thrusting attacks. The technique of half-swording, gripping the blade with one hand while holding the hilt with the other, allowed knights to use their swords like spears against armored opponents, directing precise thrusts at gaps in the armor. Specialized weapons developed specifically to counter armor became increasingly common. The war hammer, with its heavy head, designed to concentrate force into a small area, could dent or breach plate armor through sheer impact. Maces served a similar purpose, using weight and momentum to deliver crushing blows that could disable an opponent even. The morning star, with its spiked head, could catch and tear at armor joints and Poleaxes became the weapon of choice for many professional soldiers facing heavily armored. These versatile weapons combined an axe blade, a hammerhead, and a spear point on a single shaft, allowing the wielder to adapt to different tactical. A skilled poleaxe fighter could hook an opponent's armor with the axe blade, deliver crushing blows with the hammer, or thrust with the spear point as circumstance. The dagger became an essential secondary weapon for all medieval. In close combat, when primary weapons were lost or broken, the dagger provided a last line of defense. More importantly, daggers were designed to exploit gaps in armor, the joints at the elbows, knees, and armpits, or the vision slit. The technique of wrestling an opponent to the ground and then finishing them with a dagger thrust became a standard part of knightly combat. Medieval siege warfare represented perhaps the most complex and sophisticated aspect of pre-gunpowder military technique. Sieges could last months or even years, requiring enormous resources and careful. The besieging army had to maintain supply lines, construct siege equipment, and prevent the defenders from receiving reinforcements or. Meanwhile, the defenders had to manage their resources carefully while looking for opportunities to break the. Castle design evolved specifically to counter siege techniques. Early medieval fortifications were relatively simple, earth and timber constructions that could be quickly built but were vulnerable to fire and assault. The development of stone castles in the 11th and 12th centuries revolutionized defensive warfare. These massive structures, with walls 10 to 15 feet thick and towers reaching heights of over 100 feet, could withstand prolonged sieges and required specialized equipment. The concentric castle design, perfected in the 13th century, represented the pinnacle of medieval defensive art. These castles featured multiple rings of walls, each higher than the last, creating a series of defensive positions that attackers had to. The famous castles of Edward I in Wales, such as Caerphilly and Beaumaris, exemplified this design philosophy and remained virtually impregnable throughout the medieval. Siege engines were the artillery of the medieval world. The trebuchet, a massive counterweight catapult, could hurl stones weighing 300 pounds or more over distances of several hundred. These enormous machines required teams of skilled engineers to construct and. The psychological impact of trebuchets was often as important as their physical damage. The constant bombardment of heavy stones could break the morale of defenders, even when the actual damage to fortification. Mangonels and onagers provided smaller but more maneuverable alternatives to trebuchets. These torsion engines used twisted rope or sinew to store energy and could be built more quickly than the massive. They were particularly effective for throwing incendiary projectiles or diseased animal carcasses, an early form of biological warfare that could spread plague and disease within besieged. The ballista, essentially a giant crossbow mounted on a frame, provided accurate, long-range fire against specific. Ballista bolts could kill individual defenders on the walls or damage specific structural elements like gate mechanisms or towers. Some ballistae were built large enough to shoot spears that could penetrate multiple opponents or even light fortifications. Siege towers, called belfries in medieval texts, allowed attackers to approach castle walls at the same height as. These massive wooden structures, often reaching heights of 60 feet or more, were built with thick timber and covered with wet hides to protect against fire. The front face of a siege tower typically featured a drawbridge that could be dropped onto the castle walls, allowing assault troops to storm directly onto the. Battering rams represented the most direct approach to breaching castle. Simple rams were just large logs carried by teams of men, but more sophisticated versions were mounted on wheeled frames and protected by wooden roofs called cats or. The largest battering rams could weigh several tons and require dozens of men to operate. If the rhythmic pounding of a battering ram against castle gates created a psychological pressure that often proved as effective as the. Mining represented perhaps the most insidious form of siege war. Attackers would dig tunnels under castle walls, then set fires or use other methods to collapse the tunnels and bring down sections of the fort. This technique required skilled miners and could take months to execute. Defenders often countered by digging their own tunnels to intercept the attackers, leading to underground battles fought in cramped, dark conditions. The famous siege of Carcassonne in 1209 demonstrated many of these techniques in action. The attacking crusaders used trebuchets to bombard the walls, while simultaneously attempting to undermine them through mining operations. The defenders responded with their own siege engines and conducted sorties to destroy the attackers' equipment. The siege lasted several weeks before the defenders finally surrendered, more due to lack of supplies than military. Naval warfare in the medieval period was equally complex and sophisticated, though it has received less attention in pop. Medieval warships were essentially floating platforms for traditional land-based weapons. Archers and crossbowmen provided long-range fire, while boarding parties attempted to capture enemy vessels through close. The famous naval Battle of Sluys in 1340 saw English longbowmen devastate a French fleet, demonstrating that the same tactics effective on land could be adapted for Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon used by the Byzantine Empire, represented one of the most advanced military technologies of the mid. This liquid fire could burn on water and was virtually impossible to extinguish, making it devastatingly effective in naval. The exact composition of Greek fire remains unknown, as the Byzantines guarded the secret jealously, but it likely included petroleum products, sulfur, and other combustible materials. The training and lifestyle of medieval warriors varied enormously depending on their social class. Knights, as members of the nobility, underwent decades of training and maintained their skills through regular tournaments. These weren't just recreational activities. Tournaments served as both training exercises and social events that reinforced the bonds between members of the war. The famous tournaments of the 12th and 13th centuries were massive affairs that could last for days and attract knights from a tournament culture represented a unique aspect of medieval society that combined military training, social networking, religious ceremony, and economic. The greatest tournaments attracted hundreds of participants and thousands of spectators, creating temporary cities with their own economies and social. Merchants sold weapons, armor, and supplies, while entertainers provided music, food, and the economic impact of major tournaments could benefit entire regions for months after the event. The rules and customs of tournament combat evolved to balance realism with safety. Though medieval tournaments were still dangerous affairs where death and serious injury. Early tournaments were essentially mock battles with few restrictions, but gradually more sophisticated rules developed to govern different types. The joust, with its emphasis on individual skill and chivalric display, became the most prestigious form of tournament. Melee combat tested group tactics and endurance, but was gradually restricted to reduce casualties. The equipment used in tournaments was often different from battlefield gear, specialized for the particular demands of ceremonial. Tournament armor was typically heavier and more elaborate than war armor, designed more for protection and display than. Tournament lances were often hollow or designed to shatter on impact, reducing the likelihood of serious. Special tournament swords might have blunted edges or reinforced points to prevent accidental deaths during. The social aspects of tournaments were as important as the military training they provided. Young knights used tournaments to establish their reputations and attract the attention of potential patrons or employees. Established knights maintained their status and networked with peers from other. The elaborate ceremonies, heraldic displays, and courtly rituals surrounding tournaments reinforced the cultural values and social bonds that held the knightly class. Prize systems at tournaments created economic incentives that could significantly impact participants. Winners might receive valuable horses, weapons, armor, or monetary prizes that could fund their military careers for. Losers often had to forfeit their equipment or pay ransoms to their conquerors, creating a form of wealth redistribution within the war. Some knights made careers as tournament professionals, traveling from event to event and living off. The church's relationship with tournaments was complex and often contradictory. While condemning tournaments as occasions for sin and violence, church leaders recognized their value in maintaining military readiness and social. Some tournaments were organized to raise funds for religious purposes, particularly the Crusade. The timing of tournaments was often coordinated with religious festivals, creating hybrid events that combined martial and spiritual. Regional variations in tournament customs reflected different military traditions and cultural values. German tournaments emphasized group combat and tactical coordination, while French events focused more on individual prowess and chivalry. English tournaments often included contests for common soldiers as well as knights, democratizing participation to. Italian tournaments incorporated Renaissance artistic elements that transformed them into elaborate spectacles as much as military. Europe. Professional soldiers, known as men-at-arms, represented a middle class of warrior between the noble knights and common foot. These were typically younger sons of noble families or ambitious commoners who had proven themselves in. They served as heavy infantry or light cavalry and often formed the backbone of medieval. Many men-at-arms hoped to eventually be granted land and titles for their service, potentially rising to knightly status themselves. Common foot soldiers made up the majority of most medieval. These were typically peasants called up from military service by their lords or urban militia members defending their. While they received less training than professional warriors, they shouldn't be under. Many foot soldiers were skilled craftsmen in civilian life, blacksmiths, carpenters, and other artisans who brought practical skills to military. A blacksmith might not be trained in swordplay, but he understood metallurgy and could maintain and repair weapons and armor. The logistics of medieval warfare were staggering. A single knight required not just his own equipment and horses, but also support staff, squires, grooms, servants, and craftsmen. A major military campaign might involve thousands of participants and require careful coordination of supplies, transportation, and communication. Medieval armies moved slowly, not just because of their equipment, but because they had to carry everything they needed or arrange for supply lines to follow. Food was always a critical concern for medieval armies. Soldiers required enormous amounts of calories to maintain their strength for fighting, and armies could quickly exhaust local. The famous phrase, "An army marches on its stomach," was as true in medieval times as in any other. Armies often had to bring their own food supplies, including live animals for fresh meat, which further slowed their movement and increased their logistical requirements. Medical care in medieval armies was primitive but not non-existent. Many armies included barber surgeons who could treat wounds, set bones, and perform basic surgical procedures. Monasteries often served as field hospitals, with monks providing care to wounded soldiers regardless of which side they. While medieval medicine couldn't compare to modern standards, many techniques developed on medieval battlefields contributed to the development of surgical. The code of chivalry that governed knightly behavior was more than just a romantic ideal. It was a practical system for managing violence in medieval. The rules of chivalry dictated when and how knights could engage in combat, how prisoners should be treated, and what constituted honorable behavior. While these rules were often honored in the breach rather than the observance, they provided a framework for limiting the destructive potential of medieval war. The concept of ransom was central to medieval warfare, particularly among the captured knights and nobles were typically held for ransom rather than executed, creating a financial incentive to capture rather than eliminate. This system led to elaborate negotiations and exchanges that sometimes became as complex as the battles themselves. The famous capture of King John of France at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356 resulted in ransom negotiations that lasted for years. Women played important roles in medieval warfare, though these are often overlooked in traditional accounts. Noble women frequently managed castle defenses when their husbands were away. Some, like the famous Eleanor of Aquitaine, personally led military campaigns. Women also served as spies, messengers, and suppliers for armies, and the image of medieval warfare as an exclusively male domain doesn't reflect the complex reality of the impact of weather and seasons on medieval warfare cannot be over. Most campaigns were conducted during the summer months when roads were passable and supplies. Winter warfare was extremely difficult and dangerous, not just because of the cold, but because of the logistical challenges of keeping armies fed and supplied during the months when agricultural production. Many wars effectively paused during winter, with opposing armies withdrawing to winter. The famous Battle of Hastings in 1066 exemplifies many aspects of medieval. The Norman cavalry faced Anglo-Saxon infantry in a battle that lasted most of it. The Anglo-Saxons, fighting on foot with axes and shields, initially held their ground against repeated cavalry. Only when they broke formation to pursue retreating Normans were they vulnerable to counter. The battle demonstrated both the power of disciplined infantry formations and their vulnerability when that discipline broke. The 100 Years' War between England and France showcased the evolution of medieval military tactics over more than a century. Early battles like Crécy in 1346 demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of English longbowmen against French heavy cavalry. Later engagements saw both sides adapting their tactics, the French developing better ways to approach English positions, while the English experimented with combined arms tactics that integrated archers, infantry, and their own. The Siege of Orleans in 1428-1429 marked a turning point in both the 100 Years' War and medieval siege warfare. The appearance of Joan of Arc transformed what had been a conventional siege into a symbol of French national resistance. But beyond its political significance, the siege demonstrated how medieval siege techniques had reached a sophisticated. The English constructed elaborate fortifications around the city, essentially building their own town to support the castle warfare evolved continuously throughout the medieval period as both offensive and defensive techniques. The development of the gatehouse as a separate defensive structure, the use of murder holes and portcullises, and the construction of elaborate barbicans all reflected the ongoing arms race between attackers. The famous Chateau Gaillard, built by Richard the Lionheart in just 2 years, incorporated the most advanced defensive features of its time and was considered virtually impressive. The rise of mercenary companies in the later medieval period changed the nature of warfare significantly. Groups like the famous White Company in Italy or the Free Companies in France were professional military organizations that sold their services to the highest. These mercenaries were often more skilled and experienced than feudal levies, but they also introduced new problems. Mercenary companies without employment often turned to banditry, and their loyalty was all. Urban warfare became increasingly important as cities grew larger and more powerful during the later medieval. City walls became more sophisticated, incorporating new defensive techniques borrowed from castle architecture. Urban militias, composed of craftsmen and merchants, developed their own military traditions and often proved surprisingly effective against professional armies. The famous Battle of Courtrai in 1302 saw Flemish urban militias defeat French heavy cavalry, demonstrating that citizen soldiers could hold their own against professional war. The technology of metallurgy advanced dramatically during the medieval period, driven largely by military. Early medieval weapons were made from iron, but the development of steel-making techniques allowed for much superior weapons and armor. The famous Damascus steel and later European steel-making techniques produced blades that were both flexible and hard, a combination that was essential for effective swords and other weapons. Artillery began to appear in the very late medieval period, but it initially complemented rather than replaced traditional siege techniques. Early cannons were unreliable and dangerous to their operators, but they could breach walls that had previously been impregnable to traditional siege engines. The famous siege of Constantinople in 1453 saw massive cannons breach the supposedly impregnable walls of the ancient city, marking the beginning of the end for traditional medieval fortification. The social impact of medieval warfare extended far beyond the battlefield. The feudal system was essentially organized around military service, with land tenure tied directly to military obligation. Peasants worked the land to support knights, who in turn provided military service to their lords. This system created a warrior aristocracy that dominated medieval European society for centuries. Training for medieval warfare began in childhood for those destined to become professional warriors. Noble children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk, and weapons training began by age 7 or 8. The famous schools of arms that developed in the later medieval period codified fighting techniques that had previously been passed down through personal instruction. These schools produced training manuals that preserve medieval fighting techniques for modern study. The psychological aspects of medieval warfare were as important as the physical techniques. The terrifying appearance of fully armored knights, the thunderous sound of cavalry charges, and the psychological impact of siege engines were all calculated to break enemy morale before physical combat even. Medieval armies often tried to intimidate their opponents through displays of strength, elaborate ceremonies, and the use of fearsome-looking. The role of religion in medieval warfare was complex and pervasive. Wars were often justified in religious terms, with both sides claiming divine. Military orders like the Knights Templar and Hospitallers combined religious devotion with military prowess. Even secular battles were preceded by religious ceremonies, and many warriors carried religious relics or symbols into battle for protection and inspiration. The economics of medieval warfare were staggering. The cost of maintaining a single knight in the field for a year could support dozens of peasant families. Major military campaigns required enormous financial resources and often bankrupted the kingdoms that undertook. The development of military engineering, siege engines, and professional armies required significant investment in both money and human. The development of military engineering as a profession began during the medieval. Master engineers like Villars de Honnecourt became famous throughout Europe for their ability to design and construct siege engines, fortifications, and other military. These engineers combined practical experience with theoretical knowledge, often borrowing techniques from classical sources and adapting them to medieval. The famous Siege of Acre during the Third Crusade demonstrated the international character of medieval. Armies from across Europe converged on this single fortress, bringing different fighting techniques, languages, and military traditions. The siege lasted nearly 2 years and involved virtually every type of medieval warfare: siege engines, mining, naval battles, and repeated assaults on the walls. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 has become legendary not just for its military significance, but for how it demonstrated the changing nature of medieval warfare. English longbowmen fighting on foot in muddy conditions decimated a much larger force of French heavy. The battle showed how traditional medieval tactics were vulnerable to new approaches and marked the beginning of the decline of heavy cavalry as the dominant force on European. The development of specialized military architecture reached its peak during the medieval period. Castles became increasingly sophisticated, with complex defensive systems that could channel attackers into killing zones, provide overlapping fields of fire for defenders, and withstand The famous Crac de Chevalier in Syria represented the pinnacle of Crusader castle design and remained virtually impregnable throughout its history. Medieval naval technology advanced significantly during this period, driven by both military and commercial needs. The development of the cog, a sturdy sailing vessel that could carry both cargo and warriors, revolutionized both trade and naval. These ships could be quickly converted for military use by adding fighting platforms and defensive structures, allowing merchants to protect themselves from pirates and the training of archers became so important that laws were passed requiring the famous English law requiring all men to practice archery on Sundays after church service reflected the critical military importance of skill. Archery butts were established in villages throughout England, and annual competitions helped maintain and improve the skills of potential military. The role of engineers in medieval warfare extended beyond just building siege engines. Military engineers were responsible for logistics, fortification design, and the complex calculations required to aim siege engines at. Many of the mathematical and engineering principles developed for military purposes later found applications in civilian construction and technology. The famous Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 demonstrated how terrain could be used to negate traditional military advantages. The Scottish forces under Robert the Bruce used carefully chosen ground to neutralize English cavalry advantages and created conditions that favored their own tactics. The battle showed that victory often went to the side that could best adapt their tactics to local. Medieval military medicine developed techniques that wouldn't be seen again until the modern. Battlefield surgeons learned to treat arrow wounds, set compound fractures, and even perform primitive brain surgery to treat head injuries. Many medical advances made during the medieval period were lost during later periods and only rediscovered in the 19th and 20th. The logistics of supplying medieval armies on campaign were incredibly complex. Armies needed not just food and weapons, but also replacement equipment, raw materials for repairs, and the tools necessary to maintain their equipment. A major campaign might require hundreds of supply wagons and thousands of support personnel who never actually fought. The development of military intelligence during the medieval period was sophisticated and spies, scouts, and informants provided crucial information about enemy movements, strength, and intelligence. Many battles were won or lost based on intelligence gathering rather than fighting. The famous networks of spies maintained by medieval rulers often extended across multiple kingdoms and required significant resources. The impact of disease on medieval armies was often more devastating than enemy armies concentrated in small areas with poor sanitation became breeding grounds for plague, dysentery, and other. Many military campaigns failed not because of military defeat, but because disease reduced armies to ineffective. Understanding and preventing disease became crucial military skills. The role of siege warfare in medieval strategy extended beyond just capturing fortifications. Sieges were often used to draw enemy armies into unfavorable battles, to demonstrate power and resolve, or to control key transportation routes. A successful siege could shift the balance of power in an entire region, making siegecraft one of the most important military skills. The famous siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 demonstrated both the power of medieval fortification and its limitations. The massive stone keep, with walls over 10 feet thick, withstood months of bombardment from siege, and only when the attackers successfully mined under one corner of the keep did the defense finally collapse. Even then, the defenders retreated to the remaining portion of the keep and continued. The development of crossbow technology during the medieval period included innovations like the windlass and cranequin, mechanical devices that allowed crossbowmen to span much more powerful bows than would be possible with muscle power. These devices turned crossbows into siege weapons, capable of penetrating even the best armor of the period, though at the cost of reduced. Medieval armor design evolved to address specific. The development of the bassinet helmet with its pointed visor was a direct response to the threat posed by crossbow bolts. The articulated plates of medieval armor allowed for protection without sacrificing mobility, a crucial consideration for warriors who might need to fight on foot or horseback depending on circumstances. The famous Battle of Crécy in 1346 showcased not just the power of English longbows, but also the importance of choosing favorable terrain. The English position on a hill, with natural obstacles protecting their flanks, allowed their archers to devastate repeated French cavalry. The battle demonstrated that defensive tactics, properly executed, could overcome significant numerical disadvantages. The role of fortified cities in medieval warfare was crucial to understanding the period's military strength. Cities like Carcassonne or Avila, with their massive stone walls and defensive towers, served as bases for regional control and refuges for surrounding populations during times of conflict. The ability to besiege and capture these cities often determined the outcome of larger conflicts. The development of military orders during the Crusades created new models of military organization that combined religious devotion with professional military skills. Orders like the Knights Templar, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights maintained standing armies of professional warriors decades before secular kingdoms developed similar. These orders preserved and advanced military techniques during periods when secular military innovation The famous siege of Antioch during the First Crusade demonstrated the complexity of medieval logistics and the importance of maintaining supply lines. The Crusader army found itself simultaneously besieging the city and besieged by a relief army, creating a tactical situation that required innovative solutions. The eventual Crusader victory depended as much on intelligence, diplomacy, and logistics as on fight. Medieval military architecture incorporated sophisticated understanding of both offensive and defensive capabilities. The placement of towers, the design of gatehouses, and the construction of overlapping fields of fire all reflected careful consideration of how attackers might approach and how defenders could most effectively. Master builders like James George, who designed many of Edward I's Welsh castles, were as important to medieval warfare as any knight or siege. The development of military law during the medieval period established precedents that influenced warfare for rules governing the treatment of prisoners, the conduct of sieges, and the rights of non-combatants helped civilize warfare even during its most brutal. While these laws were often ignored, they provided frameworks for negotiation and diplomacy that sometimes prevented conflicts from escalating to total. The economic impact of medieval warfare extended far beyond the immediate costs of campaigns. The need to support warrior classes shaped agricultural practices, trade relationships, and technological development throughout the medieval. The famous phrase that war is the health of the state was as true in medieval times as in any other period, with military needs driving innovation and economic. The training of medieval warriors in peacetime often took the form of hunts, tournaments, and other martial exercises that maintained skills while providing entertainment and. The elaborate tournaments of the High Middle Ages weren't just entertainment. They were essential training exercises that allowed warriors to practice their skills in relatively safe environments while maintaining the social bonds that held medieval. The role of women in medieval warfare, while often overlooked, was significant and beyond the famous examples like Joan of Arc or Eleanor of Aquitaine, countless women managed castle defenses, organized supplies for armies, and even fought in battles when circumstances. The medieval world was more flexible in its gender roles than popular culture often suggests, particularly during times. The development of combined arms tactics during the later medieval period represented a significant evolution in military. Armies learned to coordinate archers, cavalry, and infantry in mutually supporting roles rather than using each arm independently. This development required new levels of training, communication, and tactical sophistication that presaged the military developments of the Renaissance period. The famous Battle of Tours in 732, while technically pre-medieval, established patterns that would influence medieval warfare for centuries. The Frankish victory over Muslim forces demonstrated the importance of disciplined infantry formations and established the reputation of European heavy infantry that would persist throughout the medieval. As our journey through medieval warfare draws to its close, we can see how these 1,000 years of conflict shaped not just military history, but the entire course of humans. From the simple spears and shields of the early medieval period to the sophisticated siege engines and articulated plate armor of the later centuries, medieval warfare represented humanity's ingenuity in both creating and the knights and castles, the longbows and crossbows, the great battles and prolonged sieges all contributed to a military culture that prized honor, skill, and courage above. The legacy of medieval military innovation extends far beyond the battlefield into every aspect of modern. The organizational principles developed to manage feudal armies influenced the development of modern corporations and government bureaucracies. The engineering techniques used to build castles and siege engines laid the groundwork for Renaissance architecture and engineering. The metallurgical advances driven by armor and weapon production contributed to the Industrial Revolution centuries later. Even modern concepts of leadership, teamwork, and professional ethics can trace their origins to medieval military culture. The social transformation wrought by medieval warfare fundamentally altered the structure of European civilization and influenced the development of democratic institutions. The rise of professional armies gradually replaced feudal levies, creating centralized nation-states that could field unified military. The tactical effectiveness of common soldiers armed with pikes and longbows challenged traditional social hierarchies and contributed to the eventual decline. The economic demands of maintaining medieval armies stimulated trade, technological innovation, and financial systems that would shape the modern. The technological evolution evident throughout the medieval period demonstrates humanity's remarkable capacity for adaptation and innovation. Each new weapon system generated countermeasures that in turn sparked further in the development cycle from simple iron spearheads to sophisticated steel crossbow prods represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. This pattern of continuous technological advancement, driven by military necessity, would accelerate dramatically with the introduction of gunpowder weapons that marked the end of the international character of medieval warfare created cultural exchanges that transcended political boundaries and contributed to the development of shared European. Knights from different kingdoms fought together in the Crusades, sharing tactical knowledge and cultural practice. Military engineers and weaponsmiths traveled throughout Europe, spreading technical innovations across national. The common language of warfare, with its shared terminology and practices, created connections that would influence European development for centuries. The human cost of medieval warfare, while often romanticized in later literature, was enormous and shaped the demographic and economic development of entire. The constant warfare that characterized much of the medieval period consumed resources that might otherwise have been used for peaceful. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but conflict, with profound effects on social structures and cultural values. Yet this same warfare also created opportunities for social mobility, technological innovation, and cultural development that wouldn't have occurred during purely peaceful. The environmental impact of medieval warfare was significant and lasting, though different from modern military environmental concerns. Siege warfare could devastate entire regions, destroying crops, forests, and agricultural infrastructure that took decades to. The demand for wood for siege engines and naval construction contributed to deforestation across much. Mining operations for metals used in weapons and armor altered landscapes and created pollution that affected local populations for generations. These warriors, fighting without the aid of gunpowder or firearms, relied instead on physical strength, technical skill, and tactical innovation to achieve. Their legacy lives on not just in the romantic literature of chivalry, but in the fundamental military principles that continue to influence war. The lessons learned on medieval battlefields, the importance of logistics, the value of combined arms tactics, the need for professional training, and the crucial role of morale remain as relevant now as they were 1,000 years ago. As we close this exploration of how medieval people fought without guns, we're reminded that human courage and ingenuity have always found ways to overcome seemingly impossible odds, and that the true measure of warriors has never been their weapons, but their willingness to stand and fight for what they believe. So ends our journey into this fascinating chapter of human history. And I hope you've enjoyed learning about these remarkable people who shaped our world with sword and shield, bow and lance. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the echoes of ancient battles and the spirit of those who fought them.